relationships and dating on Friday night. So if you're out there in the ether and you don't have plans for the night because you stay at home all day and stream like a weirdo, guilty as charged, feel free to come on in, ask your questions. As per usual, have a live Q&A. So if you got mental health related questions, relationship advice related questions, that is totally fine. A little bit of an intro and info about myself. I have worked in the mental health field for 5 years. I got the start of my journey working in the foster adoption system, have worked in inpatient psych hospitals, have seen depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, borderline, everything under the sun at this point. I've also been in grad school as a therapist. I am not a licensed therapist. I didn't finish my degree. I'm going back to do that next fall, actually. And have seen patients as a therapy intern, I should say. So, lots of experience in that regard. I'm also currently a relationship and mental health coach. What's up? How's it going? Welcome to the chat. Hello back to you. So, that's a little bit about myself. Tonight, what we're going to be talking about is I'm doing well. How are you doing? While we have our open Q&A open, we'll go ahead and talk about some stuff here. What we're going to talk about is the anxious avoidant trap in relationships. We're going to be going back into our discussion of attachment theory. So if you are unfamiliar with attachment theory, feel free to check out our replays. I feel like my stream is probably more popular with people watching my replays these days than actually showing up live. It is what it is. So the attachment replay is in the past broadcast of the stream. Feel free to check that out. The gist of it, we all grew up with a here, let's pop in here, use my lovely infographic here. Attachment theory in a nutshell. So we all grow up with our primary caregivers, and depending on how well they meet our needs, we become one of 4 attachment styles. We'll use this one. I like this graphic. This is my favorite. Ooh, but it's too small. All right, let's use... let's see. Much better. So, if your primary caregivers, for most of us, this could be your parents, but you might not have been raised by your parents, were consistently available for you. Not 100% of the time, but more often than not. Responsive to your needs, emotionally available, and all that stuff, you developed a secure attachment to other human beings, which allowed you to be self-confident, self-assured, allowed you to be comfortable and confident showing up as your authentic self, and voicing your needs and setting boundaries, right? If your caregivers were not consistently available for you in a variety of ways, then you probably develop what's called insecure attachment, of which there are 3 different types. Starting from the top here, there's anxious preoccupied, which means that you tend to be a little bit needy. So this is what happens when your primary caregivers show up for you inconsistently. If they are not consistently there for you, maybe mom or dad worked a lot, or one parent was available for you, the other one was very emotionally unavailable, that sort of thing. You develop this inconsistency that causes you to have this deep-rooted belief that if you don't chase onto people and cling on to them, you'll be abandoned. So that's anxious preoccupied. On the other end of the spectrum, the cold, distant end of the spectrum, is the avoidant dismissive. We know them, we love them. Not the funnest to be in relationships with, but they're your stereotypical emotionally unavailable folks. And so they typically grew up in a relation or environment with their primary caregivers, where their primary caregivers were one of 2 ways. Either their primary caregivers were very emotionally unavailable, or just straight up unavailable completely. Maybe they grew up in like the foster care system where they just didn't have caregivers really. Or, you know, mom and dad were, or dad were in the military and just unavailable. So they might have grown up without their needs consistently being not met, if that makes sense. So their needs were consistently unmet, and they tend to become avoidant. Or if their primary caregiver was very controlling and smothering. Typically, if they're controlling and smothering, they're also kind of emotionally unavailable for different reasons that we don't need to get into right now. But, so if either of those two cases is true, people tend to develop into what's called avoidant dismissive attachment style. And these people are marked by being really hyper independent, by being very emotionally unavailable, by being afraid of emotional intimacy, afraid to get close to others, afraid to look at their feelings, all sorts of stuff. Not to poo-poo on them, but they avoid a lot of touchy-feely things, getting close to people, their own emotions, self-reflection. Can be difficult for these people to do self-growth on themselves, not to completely poo-poo on them. But yeah, and then smack dab in the middle of that, actually ping-ponging between the two, you have what is known as the fearful avoidant, which is the last of the 3 insecure attachment styles. And these are people who typically kind of swing between being anxious, so they're kind of clingy and needy, or swing over to their avoidant side. So they display both of these core wounds. And typically, people develop both of these anxious and avoidant core wounds when their primary caregivers when they were raised in an environment that was really chaotic. And so a lot of times this can be because there's abuse in the home. Maybe one parent was stable, the other one was highly emotionally unstable. And so there's this push-pull thing that they do quite often because they're not sure what's safe and not safe. So they crave closeness, but at the same time, fear engulfment. They crave closeness, but at the same time are afraid to get too close to anyone because they might be abandoned and that might be too hurtful. And so they push people away when they get too close. They kind of do this hot-cold thing. So those are the fundamental primary attachment styles. And so what I want to talk about today is spending a little bit of time breaking down. In previous streams, we've talked about just the fundamentals of each of the attachment styles, right? What they look like, how they are formed, in a nutshell, kind of the things that we just talked about. What I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is, what do adult romantic relationships with these people tend to look like? In particular, we'll pay special attention to what's called the anxious avoidant trap. So unfortunately, what tends to happen in the real world is that secure people, because they're very good at voicing their needs, very comfortable setting boundaries, very good at showing up as our authentic self, secure people tend to get into relationships with other secure people. It's not always the case. Sometimes they can get into relationships with people that are insecurely attached. As a matter of fact, sometimes a secure person can get into a relationship with an insecurely attached person and be pushed into insecurity. This is especially true in the case of avoidance. For whatever reason, avoidance, like everybody's kryptonite. They have a habit of pushing people into anxiousness. But we'll talk about the dynamics a little bit more as the night goes on. But for the most part, secure individuals tend to get with other securely attached individuals. Now, on the insecure front, what tends to happen is that avoidance will tend to end up in relationships with anxious types. This is for a variety of reasons we'll talk about here in a little bit. And that creates all kinds of problems. So you've got one person that's clingy and is the chaser, and the other person's the withdrawer. So we'll talk about the anxious avoidant trap. And then the fearful avoidant can tend to end up being with any of these people, in which case they'll tend to swing to one end of the pole that's the opposite of whoever they're with. If they're with an avoidant person, they'll become more anxious and clingy because the avoidant person's already taking on that role of being the distancer. If they're with an anxious person, they'll tend to start to pull away and be the swing into their with is which way she'll tend to polarize into, if that makes sense. So if she's dating someone that's more avoidant, she's going to become more clingy. And if she's dating someone that's more clingy, then she's going to become more avoidant herself, if that makes sense. So fearful avoidants are kind of hop back between the two extremes. That's interesting, though. From a very broken home. Yeah, and that's a thing that we've talked about a little bit before. Fearful avoidants tend to, and I'm a fearful avoidant, so I'm not shitting on these people by any means.
And this is called the anxious avoidant trap. And I'll be starting in the graph where it says start here. The way this starts is that the anxious partner will ask for a deeper connection or has some complaint. And this leads the avoidant partner to feel rejected or not good enough. Then the avoidant partner will struggle to manage these feelings and withdraw, either emotionally or physically or both. And then the anxious partner, fearing abandonment, will pursue the avoidant partner and attempt to establish a reconnection. And then there is a reconnection with a brief sense of security. And sometimes the anxious partner will find themselves apologizing for bringing up the issue or for being too much, when usually the complaint isn't really anything.
In the first 6.
Yep. So yeah, that's a brief intro. It's essentially a big cycle that plays out a lot in relationships. And God knows I've been in more than a few, well, at least a couple relationships where that exact cycle played out. So to kind of break things down a little bit, she mentioned here, you know, the anxious partner will get close, and maybe something will happen, like argument ensues, or the anxious partner is just trying to get the avoidant partner to be more available, and then the avoidant freaks out because avoidants deep down have this fear of engulfment, right? And just typically losing their freedom, or they also have this deep down sense of they're not good enough. And if anyone gets close to them, they'll realize that they're fundamentally flawed and unlovable and they'll never be good enough. And so that causes them to really emotionally withdraw to protect themselves. And then typically some kind of fight ensues where, you know, the avoidant's pulling away, the anxious person's pursuing, there's a fight, which causes the avoidant person to pull away even more and the anxious person to chase after them even more. The avoidant person kind of just will fade out. And then the anxious person will eventually, you know, take some space or whatever, and then come back and apologize, or the anxious person will kind of give up and take space. And then once the avoidant person gets some space, then they'll be like, oh, I'm not in fear of being engulfed or controlled anymore. And then they'll come back and they'll reconcile until the next time the anxious person tries to get close or has a complaint about something, and then it'll kind of just circle over and over again. So that's the gist of it. So a lot of times in people in these types of relationships, the conflict is kind of a little bit endless. So if you're in a relationship that's just constant fighting all the time, usually it's not so much an issue with an actual thing in the relationship. I mean, maybe like the communication get bad, but more often the real source of the problem is intimacy. One person really struggles with intimacy, the other person is attempting to get intimacy, and then, you know, there's a difference in the level of intimacy both partners are comfortable with, and that's just going to keep causing fights over and over and over again, because the two people just have different like set points for what they're comfortable with, right? So I have a quick video.
Well, hello everybody.
If you think that this is something that you might recognize as a pattern in past relationships, or maybe a relationship that you're currently in, and then we'll go into some of the strategies of how to actually deal with it.
I am so excited to hop back on in here and continue our 5-part video series on the anxious avoidant trap. And so, have you ever thought to yourself, I know this relationship is unhealthy, but I can't leave this person. Why am I so afraid of being alone? I mean, this is probably the best I could do. I just know that there's so much potential here. Sometimes we're so good together. If only my partner could just kind of get with the program and stop being so afraid of love, everything would just be fine. I know if I stay strong and I love them hard enough, then they'll come around. No one else could love them as unconditionally as I do. As more of an edge, you know, someone that is a challenge. They really, you know, my partner, they really deserve someone better, someone who can return the kind of selflessness that they keep demonstrating to me. They're just going to end up disappointed in the end. And honestly, I'd be doing them a favor to just bow out now. I'm not cut out for relationships like this.
She actually does a pretty good job of characterizing like in the inside of the mind.
That perhaps you've harbored both of these sentiments to some degree at one time or another. And to my mind, these sentiments really illustrate the two extreme ends of a spectrum of ambivalence, right? Which is the context of an interpersonal romantic relationship that we are defining as the anxious avoidant trap in this 5-part video series. And so if you don't know me, my name is...
And I do want to mention this is a 5-part video series on the anxious avoidant trap by Brianna McWilliam. If you're interested in this kind of thing, or if you think that this might be characteristics of a relationship you find yourself in, she kind of talks about breaking down a lot of this stuff. Brianna McWilliam, I don't know if I'd give her my seal of approval. She's a coach. I forget if she's a licensed therapist or not. I know she is a relationship coach. I find some of her content pretty helpful. So if you're interested in her content and like this video, feel free to drop her a follow and follow her. Let's see. She's hopeful for him to change and be closer, but with me, she thinks it's too much. Yeah, I'd say she's probably a fearful avoidant then. Which makes sense if you kind of alluded to her being in a household with a lot of abuse or just general chaos. Again, fearful avoidants tend to polarize depending on their partner they're with. So I've been with fearful avoidant women. This is funny. I've been in a relationship where we both took turns being the being the avoidant person and being the anxious person. So being the clingy person, being the distant person. I've been in a relationship before where when we first met, I showed up as really distant because I'm just like, I don't want to be like yet another person like kissing this person's ass. I don't know if I'm ready to settle down. We'll just see how things go. So I was kind of keeping them at a little bit of a distance. And so early into the relationship, they were really chasing me. And then once I kind of got settled into the relationship, then I flipped and I'm like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And I want to be with this person forever. And then because of that, I started to get a little bit more like chasing of the person and she withdrew. And so fearful avoidance can totally get with other fearful avoidance and actually ping pong and like take turns. It actually tends to be like an extremely chaotic relationship that's very unstable and doesn't tend to work out. Which much to my chagrin, I learned later. But it's also very common if a fearful avoidant gets with the anxious person, they'll be polarized to be more distant because the anxious person's already doing the chasing, right? Or if they get with an avoidant person, then they'll become more clingy because they're trying to chase that person down, right? Let's see. Dad passed at 7 from cancer. Mom drunk on drugs and alcohol, and brother friend did things, and no one oh, that sucks, man. And all family disappeared. First ex of 10 years just up and left for no reason. Oh, he's definitely an avoidant then. Yeah, the internet's littered with examples of, and again, I try not to shit on avoidance because, everyone's a human and we all have our struggles and they have a lot of like deep down shame and stuff. So to just the internet's a very like unkind place if you're an avoidant person, unfortunately, because it's just littered with people that just hate your guts, unfortunately. Because, unfortunately they do harm other people a lot and really struggle to self-reflect and change that. But a very common thing with avoidance is they can be in relationships with someone for years, like literally years. The internet is littered with these examples. Avoidance being in relationships with people for years, and then just one day, like, oh, they texted me and ended it after like a 6-year relationship. It's like a totally, unfortunately normal thing. That was the first. She's with the second now. Gotcha. So she has a habit of getting with avoidant men, it sounds like. Yeah, and for a fearful avoidant, a lot of times they will tend. It's actually funny. I was watching a video on this the other day. Fearful avoidance will actually tend to wind up with 3 types of people. Because fearful avoidants have that avoidant type, they also have this deep down fear of engulfment and not getting enough space. And so often what will happen is sometimes they'll get with an anxious person, but they tend to eventually like swing avoidant and withdraw from that relationship and it falls apart. So they tend to get with other avoidants, and they'll get in a relationship with an avoidant that lasts like a really long time. But it's very emotionally unfulfilling for both of them because neither one of them is very emotionally available, right? So you get 2 emotionally unavailable people in a relationship, and it might last for years, but it's going to be very deeply unfulfilling for both of them, and then eventually it falls apart because there's no intimacy, right? Because anxious people are better at intimacy, unfortunately. Or being emotionally unavailable, I guess I should say. Or being emotionally available. Also, funny story, I've been doing a lot of looking into researching on this stuff. fearful avoidance also tend to end up in relationships with narcissists a lot, because narcissists are also highly emotionally unavailable. So I've known some people in my life that have ended up being in relationships with narcissists, and then I looked it up, and it's actually a common thing because those people are also emotionally unavailable. So for a very different reason, and so they tend to fearful avoidance. So you said in Woodster, I know I'm going on a little bit of a rant, but fearful avoidance actually very, very commonly end up in toxic relationships for a long, long time because they feel safe and comfortable. It's a kind of chaos and toxicity that they're used to, right? Because people will tend to prefer what is familiar over what's healthy, unfortunately. So a lot of times a fearful avoidant, if they grew up in a household full of chaos, they'll get with, or mom and dad were unavailable or unsafe, they'll get into relationships with people that were emotionally unavailable or unsafe. So they'll get with abusive people, they'll get with avoidance, they'll get with narcissists, because that just feels what's familiar with them. And unfortunately, if they don't want to do the work to change, yeah, I'm slowly accepting it. It just hurts. Yeah, I feel you, dude. And I'm sorry. I know I'm sitting here just kind of talking about it very academically. I've been there too, dude. Ironically, when you finally give up on them and are just like, okay, I'm over it, I'm going away, because you're giving them space, they tend to freak out and swing